9 justices, 0 dissents, 1 former president with nowhere left to run. The Supreme Court of the United States just rejected Donald Trump's emergency appeal, and they did it unanimously. That includes the 3 justices he personally appointed to the bench. Within an hour of that ruling, George Will, the Pulitzer Prize-winning conservative columnist who has shaped Republican thinking for 50 years, went on national television and said something that should stop every American in their tracks. He called Trump's legal strategy completely and irreversibly collapsed. Now, I've been covering politics for a long time. I've seen legal setbacks, I've seen political defeats, but I have never seen a moment quite like this one. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, why it happened, what George Will's reaction tells us about the fracturing of American conservatism, and what this means for the 21 and 24 election. Because this isn't just about one man's legal troubles anymore. This is about whether the Constitution still works. Let's get into it. So, let me set the stage clearly, because there's a lot of noise out there, and I want you to understand precisely what occurred. Late last week, Trump's legal team filed an emergency application with the Supreme Court. They asked the justices to pause all proceedings in his federal election interference case while they considered a much bigger question, presidential immunity. Here's the argument they made. In simple terms, Trump's lawyers claimed that a former president cannot be criminally prosecuted for actions taken while in office. Any actions ever, if you think about what that would mean in practice, it's extraordinary. It would essentially place presidents above the criminal law entirely. Commit a crime on Monday, and as long as you were president when you did it, you're untouchable forever. Now, Trump's team had a strategic reason for this appeal beyond the legal argument itself. According to multiple legal analysts, this was his last realistic chance to delay the trial until after November. If he could just push the court date past the election, he might win back the White House. And if he's president again, these federal prosecutions effectively disappear. So this wasn't just about legal principles. This was about survival. The Supreme Court's response came faster than almost anyone expected. According to Politico's January 7th reporting, the court rejected Trump's application without a single noted dissent. Let me be clear about what that means. Not one of the 9 justices thought his emergency request had enough merit to even warrant further consideration. Clarence Thomas, who has been criticized for potential conflicts of interest given his wife's involvement in post-election activities, said no. Neil Gorsuch, Trump's first Supreme Court pick, said no. Brett Kavanaugh, whose confirmation Trump championed through intense controversy, said no. Amy Coney Barrett, rushed onto the court just days before the 2020 election, said no. All of them. Every single one. And it wasn't just a procedural rejection. According to CBS News reporting, the court's order included specific language that cut to the heart of Trump's legal argument. The unsigned order stated that the application failed to demonstrate that the petitioner is likely to succeed on the merits of his immunity claims. Let me translate that from legal language to plain English. The justices are telling Trump that his core argument that presidents can't be prosecuted isn't going to work. They're signaling that even if this comes back to them on a full appeal down the road, he's going to lose. Legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin, appearing on CNN shortly after the ruling, called it the most definitive rejection of presidential immunity claims in American history. That's where we are. That's what just happened. Now, I need to explain why George Will's reaction matters so much. Because if you're under 40, you might not fully appreciate the weight this man carries in conservative circles. George Will has been the intellectual conscience of American conservatism since before Ronald Reagan took office. He won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary back in 1977. He was a founding panelist on ABC's This Week and shaped political discourse for generations. He wrote speeches for Republican presidents. He advised countless conservative politicians on everything from policy to philosophy. This is not some liberal commentator cheering from the sidelines. This is not a Democrat looking for political advantage. George Will dedicated his entire professional life to building and defending the conservative movement in America. When he speaks, the old guard of the Republican Party, the people who remember what conservatism meant before Donald Trump arrived, they pay attention. So when the Supreme Court ruling dropped, I was watching for his reaction. And within an hour, he appeared on Fox News and delivered what I can only describe as a legal and moral obituary for Trump's defense strategy. Here's what he said, and I'm quoting directly, "What we witness today is the complete evaporation of a legal fantasy." The notion that a president, having lost an election, could attempt to retain power through extra-constitutional means and then claim immunity from prosecution was always constitutionally absurd. Now it is legally dead. Think about who said that. A man who defended Republican presidents through scandals and controversies for half a century. A man who built his career on conservative principles. A man whose words carry the weight of institutional conservative judgment. When George Will says something is constitutionally absurd and legally dead, that's not partisan rhetoric. That's a verdict from within the conservative movement itself. He went on to say that this moment represents a stress test for American constitutional governance. He noted that Trump's response to this ruling and the response of his supporters will tell us whether the Republican Party remains committed to the rule of law or has, in his words, devolved into something unrecognizable. Coming from a lifelong conservative, that's a devastating indictment. Here's what most people are missing about this Supreme Court decision. It's not an isolated event. It's part of a pattern that reveals something profound about how our institutions actually function when tested. Donald Trump has built his political identity on demanding absolute loyalty from every person and every institution around him. And again, he has discovered that the Constitution and the rule of law don't bend to personal loyalty. Let me walk you through this pattern because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Start with Bill Barr in the Department of Justice. Barr came out of retirement specifically to serve as Trump's Attorney General. He wrote the memo that framed the Mueller report in the most favorable possible light for Trump. He personally intervened in cases involving Trump allies Roger Stone and Michael Flynn, interventions that career prosecutors found so troubling that some of them resigned in protest. By any reasonable measure, Bill Barr was one of the most loyal attorneys general in modern history. He went further for Trump than almost any previous AG had gone for their president. But then came the 2020 election. Trump was claiming massive fraud. He wanted the Justice Department to back him up, to declare the election corrupt, to give his claims official validation. Barr investigated. He looked at the evidence and he found nothing. The claims were baseless. According to Jonathan Karl's reporting for ABC News, when Barr told Trump the truth that there was no evidence of fraud that would change the outcome, Trump exploded at him in the Oval Office, screaming, saying Barr had betrayed him. Barr resigned shortly after. Trump has attacked him viciously ever since, calling him weak, stupid, disloyal. But here's what actually happened. Barr told the truth. That was his sin. Not disloyalty to Trump, loyalty to reality. Now look at what happened with the Supreme Court during the 2020 election challenges. Trump and his allies filed over 60 lawsuits challenging election results in various states. They went to the Supreme Court multiple times, fully confident that the 3 justices Trump had appointed would deliver for him. After all, Trump had told his supporters that this was why those appointments mattered. He said he needed his judges on the court in case of an election dispute, but the court rejected every single election challenge, often unanimously, often without even agreeing to hear oral arguments. Trump appointed a third of the current court, and they ruled against him repeatedly, not because they were disloyal, because his claims lacked legal merit. The law doesn't care who appointed you. Then there's Mike Pence. Pence spent 4 years as perhaps the most differential vice president in modern memory. He defended Trump through the Access Hollywood tape, through Charlottesville, through 2 impeachments, through every controversy imaginable. He was the bridge between Trump and evangelical voters, between Trump and traditional conservatives. But on January 6, 2021, Trump demanded that Pence do something the Constitution didn't allow him to do: unilaterally reject electoral votes and overturn the election results. Pence refused, not because he was disloyal to Trump personally, but because the Constitution gave him no such power. He took his oath to the Constitution seriously, and for that act of constitutional fidelity, Trump turned on him completely. A violent mob stormed the Capitol chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." According to testimony before the January 6th committee, Trump expressed support for that sentiment while watching it unfold on television. 4 years of unwavering loyalty meant nothing the moment Pence chose the Constitution over Trump. Even Mitch McConnell, who spent years accommodating Trump, pushing through his judicial nominees, blocking Democratic legislation, even McConnell reached his limit after January 6th. After voting to acquit Trump on procedural grounds, McConnell took to the Senate floor and declared Trump practically and morally responsible for the attack on the Capitol. Do you see the pattern here? Every person, every institution that Trump expected to bend to his will eventually encountered a moment where the law or the Constitution required them to say no. And every time that happened, Trump treated it as betrayal. This Supreme Court decision is just the latest chapter in that pattern. 3 justices Trump put on the bench looked at his legal argument and found it without merit. They didn't betray him. They did their jobs. Let me explain why Trump's legal team is now in an impossible position and why this goes beyond just losing one appeal. Trump's entire legal strategy in the federal election case was built around delay. According to the Washington Post's analysis from January 6th, his team privately expressed confidence that they could push the trial past November through a combination of appeals and procedural maneuvers. The plan was straightforward: file motion after motion, appeal after appeal, drag everything out, and hope the calendar runs out before the jury convenes. According to MSNBC's legal analysis, Trump's lawyers filed more pretrial motions in this case than in any federal criminal prosecution in recent memory. They challenged everything: the venue, the judge, the constitutionality of the prosecution itself. At first, it seemed to be working. Every appeal takes time. Every motion requires a response. The clock kept ticking. But then something happened that Trump's team didn't anticipate. The court started moving fast, really fast. Judge Tanya Chutan denied motion after motion, often with pointed language criticizing the defense's arguments as meritless. When Trump's team appealed her immunity ruling to the D.C. Circuit, that court didn't just reject his claims. They issued a sweeping 57-page opinion that systematically demolished his legal reasoning. The appeals court wrote that the president is not above the law and that accepting Trump's argument would grant presidents a lifelong get-out-of-jail-free card. Still, Trump's lawyers had one more card to play: the Supreme Court. Surely they thought the justices would want to take their time with this historic question. They'd hold oral arguments. They'd write lengthy opinions. The process would take months, pushing the trial well past November. That calculation just proved catastrophically wrong. The court said no immediately, unanimously. What does this mean practically? On January 8th, Judge Chukan issued a new order setting a trial schedule. She wrote that the defendant has exhausted his appellate remedies regarding the immunity question and that there is no legal basis for further delay. Her language was remarkably pointed. She wrote that the defendant's repeated attempts to postpone these proceedings do a disservice to the public interest in the timely resolution of criminal charges and to the integrity of the judicial process. That's about as direct a rebuke as you'll ever see from a federal judge. Here's the impossible bind Trump's legal team now faces. On one hand, they need to maintain the support of Trump's political base. According to a YouGov poll from January 3rd, 71% of Republican primary voters believe Trump is being unfairly targeted by politically motivated prosecutors. Any lawyer who publicly acknowledges the weakness of Trump's legal position risks being fired and attacked. On the other hand, they have to actually defend Trump in court where judges aren't impressed by political rhetoric. They need real legal arguments, and their strongest argument, presidential immunity, just got demolished at every level of the federal judiciary. An effective legal defense at this point would probably require Trump to do things he seems psychologically incapable of doing: acknowledging wrongdoing, expressing remorse, perhaps cooperating with prosecutors. But Trump's entire brand is built on never admitting fault, never backing down, never showing weakness. He still cannot accept that he lost the 2020 election, much less that his attempts to overturn it were criminal. Andrew McCarthy, a former federal prosecutor and contributing editor at National Review, a conservative voice who has often been sympathetic to Trump's positions, went on Fox News and said, "Trump's legal team is now in a position where their best arguments have been rejected at every level of the federal judiciary, and they have nowhere left to go but trial." Jonathan Turley, another conservative law professor, said the Supreme Court's unanimous rejection sends an unmistakable signal that Trump's immunity claims were viewed as fundamentally without merit. When legal experts from across the ideological spectrum use phrases like complete collapse and nowhere left to turn, that's when you need to pay attention. So let's talk about what this means for real people, for voters, for the Republican Party, and for the country. First, the immediate political fallout. Trump's trial could now begin in February or March. Think about what that means. A former president standing trial for attempting to overturn an election right in the middle of primary season. Republican strategists quoted in Politico expressed deep concern about this timing. Every day Trump spends in a courtroom is a day he can't spend on the campaign trail. Every piece of damaging evidence presented is another news cycle dominated by his legal troubles rather than his political message. Democrats are planning to take full advantage. They will hammer one point relentlessly that even the Supreme Court, including Trump's own appointees, rejected his claims. That argument neutralizes the partisan witch hunt defense that Republicans have been using. But here's where it gets complicated. Within the Republican Party itself, those moderate Republicans trying to balance their constituents' enthusiasm for Trump with concerns about electability and governance are now in an extraordinarily difficult position. The Supreme Court just handed Democrats an enormous talking point that's impossible to dismiss as partisan. Meanwhile, the MAGA true believers are doubling down hard. According to social media analysis from Media Matters, within hours of the ruling, Trump supporters were attacking the Supreme Court itself as part of a deep state conspiracy. Some called for impeaching the justices Trump appointed. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, one of Trump's most vocal congressional supporters, suggested on social media that the Supreme Court has been compromised and called for patriotic Americans to make their voices heard. That kind of language suggesting that the highest court in the land is illegitimate when it rules against your preferred candidate is genuinely dangerous. It's the same logic that led to January 6th. George Will addressed this directly. He said, "We're witnessing not simply a legal defeat for one man, but a stress test for American constitutional governance." According to a CBS News poll from January 5th, 62% of Americans believe that if Trump is convicted of a felony, he should be disqualified from holding office. The Constitution doesn't actually require that a convicted felon can legally run for president, but public sentiment shapes elections. Independent voters in particular expressed deep discomfort with the idea of voting for a convicted felon for president. Those are exactly the voters who decide close elections. Republicans now face an agonizing choice: stick with Trump through a trial and potential conviction, risking electoral disaster in November, or try to pivot to another candidate, risking a mega revolt that could tear the party apart. There's no good option, only less bad ones. So, what happens next? I'm going to be careful here because I don't make predictions, but I can lay out the possibilities. The legal implications of this Supreme Court denial extend far beyond Trump's immediate case. Courts have now established clearly that former presidents can be prosecuted. That doesn't mean it will happen often, and it doesn't mean it should happen for political reasons, but it means the ultimate check on presidential power. The criminal justice system remains available when a president's conduct is truly egregious. If Trump had succeeded with his immunity claims, presidents could have committed any crime up to and including attempting to stay in power after losing an election with no fear of legal consequences. The only remedy would have been impeachment, which has proven nearly impossible in our polarized era. The courts have now closed that loophole forever. As for the trial itself, legal experts say it could begin within weeks. The evidence will go to a jury, and for the first time in American history, a former president will face 12 citizens who will decide whether his actions after the 2020 election were criminal. If Trump is convicted and held accountable, it will affirm that American democracy, for all its flaws, still functions. It will demonstrate that our institutions, tested as never before, ultimately held. If he somehow escapes accountability, either through legal maneuvers no one has yet imagined, or by winning the election and making the prosecutions disappear, it will send a very different message about what future presidents can get away with. All right, let me bring this together with 3 key points I want you to remember. 1, the Supreme Court unanimously rejected Trump's immunity claims, including all 3 justices he appointed. This isn't a partisan decision. This is the law. 2, George Will, one of conservatism's most respected voices for 50 years, called Trump's legal defense completely and irreversibly collapsed when the intellectual father of modern conservatism says that it matters. 3, this ruling follows a pattern. Every institution, Trump expected personal loyalty from the Justice Department, the Supreme Court. His vice president eventually chose the Constitution over him. That's not betrayal. That's how the system is supposed to work. Here's what I'd like from you. We're watching history unfold in real time. The next few months will be studied in textbooks for generations. And I think it matters that we understand it clearly, not through partisan spin, but through careful analysis. If this breakdown helped you see the bigger picture, I'd appreciate you leaving a comment with your honest thoughts. I read them. They shape how I cover these stories. And if you want to stay informed as this develops, and it's going to develop fast, subscribe to the channel. I'll be covering every major development with the same depth and the same commitment to getting the facts right. The walls have closed in. The highest court has spoken. And now, for the first time, a former president will face a jury for allegedly trying to overturn an election. We're living through a turning point. Let's make sure we understand